Welcome to 13.5 video lesson underneath Algebra 2. The concept is the cosine function, and there's only 4 boxes. This lesson should be pretty straightforward given the fact that we have already studied the sine curve, so it should be pretty good to go. So let's get right into it. So box number 1, we're talking about where does the sine curve come from. So you will remember that the sine curve came from the unit circle, so it must be true that the cosine curve also comes from the unit circle. Let's also remind ourselves that the cosine curve is all of the x values in all of these points around the unit circle. So if I were to, for example, go through and highlight all the x values, this one, that one, that one, that one, this one, and this one, you could see in quadrant 1, the cosine of 0 is 1. That's this point right here. That at 45 degrees, the cosine is rad 2 over 2. So 45 degrees is right in between 0 and pi over 2, so it would be right up here. This would be rad 2 over 2. At 90 degrees, which is pi over 2, you notice that the cosine is worth 0. And then, of course, if we keep going all the way around the unit circle, the cosine of 180 is negative 1. So at pi, which is the equivalent of 180 degrees, I'm down here at negative 1. At 3 pi over 2, you can see I'm back to 0. I'm back to 0 over here, and finally when I go all the way around at 2 pi, I'm back to 1 again. So the basic cosine curve is going to look like this. It looks just like a sine curve, except it's been shifted over just a little bit by pi over 2. So we are responsible for being able to sketch a cosine curve rather quickly, and we're going to use these 5 points: 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So those are the points that we want to make sure that we understand and have down for a cosine curve. And that's box number 1 for you. Box number 2 is all about interpreting a cosine graph. We're going to talk about these 4 things: the domain, the period, the amplitude, and the range. Okay. First, the domain is all real numbers. So for us, for the cosine curve, the domain is all real numbers. What that means is really it's all real angles. So it's the entire x-axis. I can plug anything that I want in, and I can take the cosine of that angle. There is no angle for which a cosine doesn't exist, so we are good to go. So the domain is going to be all real numbers. That's how we say it. The period for a cosine curve, remember, we're going to trace out one period here. So we're going to trace out one. Remember, the period is the distance in radians to complete one full cycle. So if I complete one full cycle right now with my pen, and then I look down, I can see that it's gone from 0 to 2 pi. So the period is worth 2 pi. Notice that that is exactly the same period for a sine function. So cosine and sine have the same period. Okay, the range is the highest point and the lowest point. So the highest point that I can see on a cosine curve is worth 1, and the lowest point is worth negative 1. And we're going to include those points. So it goes from negative 1 all the way to 1. Okay? And the amplitude, of course, remember the amplitude is the distance from the midline to the highest or the lowest point. So the highest and lowest point is worth 1. So it is the absolute value of 1, or in this case, the amplitude is just worth 1. So we are responsible for these 4 facts. The domain is all real numbers, the period is 2 pi, the amplitude is worth 1, and the range is from negative 1 to 1. Okay, box number 3, we are going to sketch the graph of y equals 1.5 the cosine of 2 theta. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to figure out the period. And the way that we figure out the period, you may recall, is we take 2 pi and we divide it by whatever number is in between the trig function and theta. So in this case, it happens to be 2. 2 pi divided by 2 is worth pi. So what does that mean? That means that I need to start and end an entire cosine curve on a distance of pi. Now, there's a distance of pi. So I need to start and end a cosine curve on that distance. And the 1.5, you may recall, is the amplitude. So that tells me how high and how low. So a cosine curve has this shape, okay? It has a high point, a midpoint, a low point, a midpoint, and a high point. Those are the 5 points for a cosine curve. Since the amplitude is 1.5, it's going to start up here at 1.5, okay? That means it's going to end at 1.5 too. So notice that on a distance of pi, this is my period of pi, I have the 2 high points. So I've taken care of this one, I've taken care of that one. Now the low point is going to be halfway in between the middle, so it's going to be down here at 1.5. And that means that in between 0 and pi over 2, or this point, which would be pi over 4, because that's half the distance between 0 and pi over 2, it's pi over 4. So that's going to be my first quarter point. And then I'm going to count by pi over 4s. So 1 pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, so this has to be 3 pi over 4. And I'm going to have another point. So this is what my cosine curve is going to look like. And then of course if I just continued that on and had to go some more and draw a full cycle on 2 pi, it would look like that. Also recall that the 2 means that I'm going to have 2 full cosine curves on a distance of 2 pi, which goes from here to here. But most of the time, you guys, I would be totally fine with if you gave me one cycle or one period of the graph itself. So y equals 1.5 cosine 2 theta is graphed below. Okay, box number 4 is a U-try. I'm going to call this graph number 1. Oh, there's a pen, sorry. I'm going to call this graph number 1, and I'm going to call this graph number 2. Which of the following is the graph of y equals 3 cosine 1/2 theta? Y equals 3 cosine 1/2 theta. Is it graph number 1 or is it graph number 2? Okay, the answer is number 1. The answer is number 1. So hopefully you realize that the period is worth 4 pi, and you can see that that is true in both of these. The period is indeed worth 4 pi. Hopefully you can also see that the amplitude is worth 3, so that means the distance from there to the midline is worth 3, and that's both 3 in both cases. The only difference is that graph number 1 is an actual graph of a cosine curve, and graph number 2 is the actual graph of a sine curve. And the way that I know that is because the shape. The shape here is high, middle, low, middle, high. That's a cosine curve. A sine curve goes middle, high, middle, low, middle. So the answer is number 1.